Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Today, another installment of Rapid Fire Q&A. So, let's kick it. First question is extremely relevant for you two because I know on the current course development you've been focusing on, you've kind of dove right into this topic. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on jump testing protocols?
I mean, jump testing protocols are awesome because jumping is such a important element of most sports. It's very telling as an athletic skill. It can showcase a bunch of different things. But our thoughts, though, on jump testing protocols, it's very complicated to narrow it down to one or a perfect protocol because the literature on this is all over the place. And you also need to consider what is the equipment availability by the coach. So a lot of protocols nowadays stem from the lab, which is very force plate heavy. I know that force plates are getting more and more popular. It's more accessible, but there's still a wide range. I would say it's the majority of our students that do not have access to these types of technologies. So some of these tests are not super relevant, like the dynamic strength index. Like the only way you can really figure that out is through a mid-thigh pull with a force plate, and then, you know, or RSI, you need the technology to calculate like ground contact time or flight time and on and on. So
yeah, at least RSI, a lot of contact mats and the likes of iPut, you can do it because they can calculate the jump height and the ground contact time. But yeah, like dynamic strength index, you need a force plate. There's no other way about it. But yeah, the literature is all over the place. The protocols are all over the place. So like we've been really hammering in just to try and refine everything as much as possible. And there's loads of really, really relevant jump protocols. It's a matter of what is the most applicable to give you results is actually going to dictate your training and is very, very efficient on a time perspective and equipment perspective. So we're, again, trying to make it as accessible to all the coaches as possible.
And also even to some test or some protocol, which are really, really cool, the more you dig into them, the more you realize, okay, this is really good, but this is more relevant for high-level sprinters, might not be as relevant for my field hockey team that I'm coaching.
But you still, I've heard you say how the jump test, like testing the vertical jump, for example, is extremely relevant for testing like improvements in performance.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, I mean, okay, that's interesting because now you can use jump tests for two purposes. You can do a vertical jump test and use the Sayers equation to use this as a basically description of your power output level at this point in time, and then you periodically test your vertical jump to make sure that your power output increases over time to qualify if your training is working or not. That's really cool. But somehow in my head, when you read that question, I was thinking more about jump test in the purpose of assessing weaknesses in the athlete in order to guide the training. And when you're using jump tests for that purposes, that's where like the protocols are really, really weird. Like, for example, if you take the eccentric utilization ratio test, which is a really cool test where you're measuring squat jump versus counter movement jump. If you look at the threshold of performance on most sources right now, they talk about 1.1, which is you take your counter movement jump divided by your squat jump, and 1.1 is kind of like that threshold. If you're less than 1.1, it means one thing. If you're above 1.1, it means another thing. But when you go and read the original study by Michael McGuigan, what's interesting is nowhere in his study does he talk about 1.1 being that threshold. Actually, the threshold is all over the place. It depends on the sport and on and on.
Yeah, like in that study, the examples up above 1.3, like there was such a wide range that even if they had have added them all up and averaged it out, firstly it wouldn't have been 1.1 because it would have been higher than that, but it would have been such a large range that it wouldn't have made for a actual average. They would have had to use like a plus or minus, like give variation, just because it was such a broad spectrum of results in the McGuigan study. But like on the eccentric utilization ratio, like I think it was in the 90s. If it wasn't 90s, early 2000s, Dan Baker wrote about it as well, and he found all best performing jump athletes were between 1.15 and 1.2. So where the 1.1 ever came from, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and Dan Baker, it's interesting because not only is he very in-depth with research, but he's also coached athletes from a wide range of team sports. So if you're dealing with team sports, well, Dan Baker's information is quite relevant. And then if we look at one of our colleague, Joseph Coyne in Australia, he deals more with jumpers and sprinters, but wasn't he talking about like 1.2?
He used the range, so he's 1.15 to 1.2 as well. Yeah. And but more of his athletes are on the 1.2 side. But he uses that range as if you're in between this, you're pretty balanced. If you're either side of that range, you need to work on the weaknesses.
Yeah. So I guess our point here is the EUR is awesome, but then the interpretation, if you're just looking at what most people say, well, is it truly accurate? Because McGuigan never talks about it. And then you have Baker and Coyne or use something else. And I think even like Cressy uses. Yeah,
so Cressy's range is even bigger. His is 1.1 to 1.3. And if you're in between the 1.1 and 1.3, you're seemingly balanced. And if you're either end, you need to work on the weaknesses. But that's a huge range. That's to say someone's balanced when there's a 20% discrepancy. That's a huge, to me, it's nearly too big of a range. Now, that their number was from, I think, it's an earlier 2000s article. So maybe he's refined it
2006.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so he's maybe refined it over the years, but when he was talking about it back then, it's a huge spectrum of results.
Yeah, so I think that you can use the test because it's awesome, but then you take a step back and you can modify the range to better fit the group of athletes you're dealing with. So for example, us, because we're more team sports driven with our programming and periodization model, it's to us the Dan Baker range makes more sense because we're comparing apples to apples.
Yeah.
So, but we're not just blindly using the whatever GymAware recommendation of 1.1 blah blah.
Yeah. And there's loads of other tests. You could do velocity profiling, so force velocity profiling with jumps, and do loaded, from unloaded to loaded jumps up to a certain percentage of your body weight, and then based on all that, you dictate the training whether it needs to be more force dependent or more velocity dependent. It's a more in-depth test. It takes longer, but you get really, really good information out of it. So if you want to do that, it's a great way, but just know it's more of a time commitment, and it's something that unless you have somewhat of a meaningful time to change that force velocity curve, you maybe aren't going to enact a massive amount of change in a short amount of time. So it just sort of depends on the clientele and your time frame, and it's one that is super important that every jump is carried out in the exact same manner, because allowing, as the loads get heavier, if you're allowing the athlete to dip further and go lower to generate more, to allow themselves to have more distance to generate force, it's going to skew the results. So it's one of those, then your actual carrying out of the test becomes really, really important, and you have to be really, really strict.
Yeah, and then it also depends for our listeners. It also depends who you're training. So if you're training a professional athlete or elite level amateur athlete that's preparing for the Olympic, well, you want to be super targeted with the force velocity profile to work on what's needed the most. But if you're training the youth athletes, and I'm not talking about like elementary school level, but let's say the high school athlete, and you want to start introducing power training, well, you're actually better off just simply going down the speed strength continuum in a progressive manner, no matter what, than to try to target very specific force velocity metrics too early in the training age. So depending on who you're training, you do the vertical jump just as a measure of power, but to use this to guide your training when you're this young might not be necessary.
Yeah. And then you also have to take into account to make sure reactive strength is being accounted for. So like with load velocity profiling, if you're just doing that with unloaded to loaded vertical, like counter movement jumps, it's not really going to give you an indication of their current level of reactive strength. So you maybe are going to have to pair that with an RSI test. So something like the 510. So in the 510 test, you do one counter movement jump followed by 10 somewhat pogo jumps, but as fast a reactive jump for minimizing ground contact time and maximizing height on each jump. And then from those 10 jumps, the 5 best get removed and averaged out, and you get a score. But that could help qualify the level of plyometric you prescribe for that trainee, but it still doesn't tell you if that trainee needs to focus on plyometrics. More so, it just tells you where they are able to start. So it gets convoluted.
Yeah.
Or even if you have a really, really high score in RSI, then it tells you, well, you might not need to keep on working on reactive strength because you're so good at it. You might want to focus more on max strength or high force explosive strength.
Yeah, like it's funny because having a really, really good RSI score says, oh, you are able to do really intense plyometrics, but you might need it. Like it's one of those, like you're able to do it, but whether it's going to benefit your training, it's left to be seen.
To go back to kind of the question and a point you brought up during it. So what are your thoughts on jump testing protocols? And I know both of you said it at one point, like there is an emphasis on the actual execution of the jump test protocols, right? Like you have to show the athlete how to do it. And then if they're not properly doing it, run it again. Like how do you handle that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to show the technique. They can practice a little bit, but then once you feel they're ready to go, then you need, typically in most protocol, you need 3 tries, and you take the best of 3 tries. But a lot of it's important that you dip at the same height, that you land at the same spot, especially if you use contact mats, because if you land at a different spot, then you're lengthening the flight time, so you're kind of changing the actual expression of vertical power.
Make sure you're landing with your leg extended, not your knees bent, because that's going to lengthen the time you're in the air. A big one that people are normally very lax about, but they shouldn't be, is allowing excessive torso lean.
Yeah.
So especially in the squat jump, the squat jump, you're trying to stay as upright as possible. Go down, pause for your allotted time, and then explode up from that static position. But you'll see a lot of athletes try and cheat the system, and while they'll hold the right position before they make the movement to go back up in the squat jump, they'll dip at the hips, so they'll break at the hips, so they can create more momentum through hip extension.
Yeah, they're doing a good morning to generate more force.
And it gets you higher, but it ruins the test.
And then it also, if you really want to just look at lower body force expression, then you put your hands on your hips, because if you use your hands to assist with the jump, depending on the person, it can be a 10 or 15%.
Up to 20
difference in the performance ability. So that's why, like, if you're like, because the way we do it with athletes, when we're doing the vertical jump as a continual measure of power expression, we do it with the arms because in sports you're using your arms. But if we're using a jump protocol for devising a periodized model, then we use the hands on the hips because we really just want to see what's going on in the lower body.
Well, it's like, I know in the NFL combine, and then I know a lot of like high school sports use it as well, the Vertec for testing vertical jump, but there is a lot of technique to something like the Vertec when you're testing it.
Yeah, so if that is how you need to perform, it's very important that you practice that way, but it's no more accurate than the other means, like the contact mats and I put and stuff like that there, which are way easier, way less setup. So if you need, that's how you need to practice. So say you're going to the combine, you better practice with a Vertec because learning the reach and all that there is going to make a significant difference.
Yeah, because if you jump too far away from the Vertec, then you're hitting the plastic things during your descent. You can depress the shoulder blade at first, and then protract the shoulder blades on top. So it's a bunch of things like this that will affect the score.
Yeah. And then if we're just looking at power output, it's really good to get a measure of vertical power and horizontal power. So you can do the same thing as Steph was saying, but do it as a broad jump. And then Brian Mann has an equation to work out the power output from the broad jump. So you just track that like the vertical jump throughout.
Like I said, you guys have a lot to say on this topic. I know before we move on to the next question, Steph, earlier this week or last week, I'm confused now, you had a consultation with a student regarding youth training. And I just kind of wanted you to briefly summarize some of the key points you focused on with him because the athlete was extremely young. How old?
10.
10, yeah.
So, 10-year-old athlete that played football. So he was a prepubescent. Obviously, you have chronological age and biological age. So, sometimes some younger people can be more developed. It can be up to 4 to 5 year difference. But he was prepubescent. So it's important to understand that with the prepubescent, you need to focus on completely different things than a adolescent past puberty. So, for example, the elementary school level athlete, you can actually start lifting at 5 or 6, but we're talking more about like technical drills, like with light weights, light barbells, like bands, and you're doing like key motor patterns or some key single joint movements in a 2 to 3 sets, 6 to 8 rep type of window, but not the failure. It's all technical. What you're trying to do in the weight room with these kids is to work on intermuscular coordination, work on positioning, work on body awareness, make sure that they get proper range of motion. Because what's interesting is the ideal age to develop flexibility is between the age of 6 and 11. So the more you focus on range of motion through exercises or targeted flexibility work, and the higher your level of flexibility is prior to hitting puberty, the easier it will be past it to be efficient at sporting actions, because past puberty, it's way harder to develop flexibility. I'm not saying you can't, it's just way harder. So the higher your ceiling pre-puberty, the easier it will be to maintain that post-puberty. So people who are bypassing flexibility early on, it's a great disservice if you want that kid to be a great athlete. And then you have everything that's coordination, agility. So agility, we're talking about change of direction, reactive change of direction, balance, stability, all of this. needs to be trained pre-puberty. That's when the brain absorbs all of that information and actually builds a long-lasting level of agility, balance, coordination. Because past puberty, the trainability of these skills are very, very, very low. So you need to maximize it prior to. And then we're talking about short distance speed. So everything that's acceleration. And you will develop speed mostly through low-level plyometrics and those short sprint acceleration. And then like hypertrophy is a complete waste of time. Conditioning is a waste of time, and endurance is a complete waste of time. And actually, it's actually
again, we're talking about prepubescent.
Prepubescent, because endurance would be doing a disservice, because at that age you can actually morph, if you want, your ability to recruit different types of muscle fibers. So at a time where you're trying to develop speed and agility and coordination, you don't want to spend extra time working on endurance where you're targeting slow twitch muscle fibers. So and the training should not be very structured at that age. It should be fun. It should be
different.
Like you should use a parallel model, which means that you're doing a bunch of everything all at once. So a training session might be a mix of agility, coordination drills with short acceleration speed, a little bit of plyo, a few strength training exercises that are more technical rehearsal, and then some flexibility work. So all of this within one session, multiple times a week, along with doing a wide range of sports. So individual sports, team sports, and then sports that requires a lot of like skills with the lower limb, skills with the upper limbs.
I think that's the key. I think a lot of kids now are like they specialize so quickly into a thing. Like if they did gymnastics, you'd cover a lot of like body weight stuff. You'd cover flexibility, plyometrics,
lower,
all that stuff. If you did sprint, if you did track, if you did taekwondo, whatever, all those things.
So like gymnastics, track and field, soccer,
Olympic
basketball,
Olympic
weightlifting, taekwondo.
Yep.
These are all good examples of
yoga.
sports.
Yoga was created for kids actually in schools.
Yeah, yoga would be great.
Yep.
Yeah, but one of the cool things about kids that age actually lifting and just doing the technical stuff is once they hit the growth spurt stage, they're going to be way better off, because if anyone's trained someone going through a big growth spurt, they know it's a nightmare, because every week they're learning their squat pattern again because it's so different. But if the kids already have good body awareness and technical awareness, they can sort of figure it out a little easier, and the way better progression through those years. So it means they can maximize that. Like more, this would be more sure for boys, but the 14 to 17-year-old age, they can maximize that more. Girls would be closer to like 12 to 14, 15. But yeah, it makes a huge difference to that age if they've got a bit of technical rehearsal beforehand.
Yeah, 100%. Like even like, I mean, that's a lot of Olympic weightlifter, but Klokov's a great example. His dad was an Olympic lifter, so Vladimir Klokov started like, I think it was like at 3 or something like that.
Yeah.
So of course, like he's developed the skill so early that it's like riding a bike, right?
Okay. Next question.
Not Vladimir, Dmitry Klokov. Sorry.
Do you ever prescribe aerobic training? When, how much?
Well, yes. So when I trained Gaelic football teams, I prescribed a lot of aerobic training. Again, back to Dan Baker, he's mentioned earlier in the EUR, like I used a lot of his MASS concept, which is maximal aerobic speed. So that is, you find out the maximal aerobic speed of the individuals, and you can prescribe your training based on that. So for a maximum aerobic speed test, generally we did a 1600 meter test, but anything is going to require over 5 minutes of continuous running will give it to you. You can also do this on a rower, you can do it on a bike if you want to do it yourself. You find your mass, so your maximum aerobic speed, so the maximum speed you can maintain aerobically, so that's why it needs to be so long. and then you work out what that is per second, and then you prescribe your training from there. And then some of the training sub-maximal, some is super maximal. So you could be doing 120% of mass work in an interval style training, or you could be doing 70 to 90% of mass work as continuous style and doing that there. But yeah, depending on the clientele you're working with, aerobic training can be nearly as important as anything else. For people who just want general health and movement, like zone 2 is huge. Do we like physically prescribe like progressions? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It could just be get this amount of zone 2 work in per week. But
I mean, zone 2, it's not super intense, but it's intense enough to elicit some positive adaptations in terms of mitochondrial function and capillary numbers of capillaries. So for people who have hereditary components of like heart issues, or clients who have high blood pressure, doing zone 2 will be really good. But also eventually, so this would be a good expression of aerobic capacity, but then you might want to dig into some aerobic power, so bumping things up slowly from 2 to zone 3 to some zone 4 work, because we also know that individuals who improve their VO2 max also improve their longevity, because, I mean, you're just improving your cardiovascular function. And
it doesn't take much. It's like 4 or 5 minutes of high intensity, like training, like intervals, like a few times a week is enough to get that.
Yeah, but this is not aerobic.
No, it's not aerobic.
No. Because I mean, VO2 max, you can improve it 2 ways: by increasing the intensity of your aerobic work, or by really dipping into anaerobic lactic capacity. So like a bridge between both is often a really good way to develop or improve your VO2 max. So like Alex said, like really short, high intensity intervals are great for that. It's just not theoretically aerobic.
Sometimes I just think it's a simple thing because it's not something we talk about constantly within our education, but our education is way more heavily focused on program design and periodization of strength training that people don't like just think we completely ignore it, but that's not true. I mean, it's just not what we focusing on.
It's also from where we come from. Carlos was very anti-aerobics and
it
like
kills
if you
your gains.
It kills your gains.
Yeah,
you can still gain muscle even if you're doing steady state cardio.
Then it's so dependent on who you're working with, because even if it's, say it's a body composition person who would really benefit from aerobic work, we still focus on the weight training side of things, because that is what we
control.
Can control 100%, because we can prescribe them to do aerobic work and stuff like that there, but they're most likely not going to pay their trainer to watch them be on a treadmill or a bike.
I stood beside a lot of treadmills getting my
first ever personal trainer that I worked with. Every session, the first 15 minutes was her standing next to me as I did the treadmill.
But it's interesting though, because I'll just take my background with aerobic work. It's like when I did my bachelor's degree at the University of Montreal, 2 of my professors are really, 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 really well known aerobic researchers and coaches. One of them is Luc Léger, who developed the Léger-Boucher test. That's a straight up aerobic guy. And ironically, Luc Léger is the professor that Charles started his master's with. And then another one of my professors was Daniel Mercier, who ended up he was hired by France to be the rugby energy systems coach. And he's an aerobic guy. And then our first boss in St. Louis, who used to work for Charles Poliquin in Phoenix, Nelson Ayat, was the Canadian biathlon coach, who was very aerobic. So people don't realize that although we work with Charles Poliquin, a lot of people that we worked for or learned from had a huge aerobic background.
I'll wrap up this question with one more question from me to you. So we're approaching the new year, as always. Last year I started with, I went way too hard, but last year I did like 3 months of cardio every single day. So I'm approaching the new year, you as my coach. So what do you want me to do for my cardio next year to start?
I mean, what you did last year was great, except the fact that you didn't listen to me and you just did way too much of it.
Got addicted.
Yeah, so you were doing it like every day nonstop. So I liked what you did. I would just reduce the frequency.
But would you just have me do that? Or because I know you eventually also wanted me to introduce. So what do you specifically want me to do? Like how many times per week?
That again, because the problem is.
So say it, what you want me to do.
Say it.
I'm explaining it. The problem is, so last year you did 12 weeks of pure aerobic capacity.
Yeah.
And that build up into some aerobic power. After that 12 weeks, which that served as a base, then I wanted you to start introducing anaerobic intervals mixed in with a few aerobic sessions. But then that killed you. So then you didn't do any type of cardio for the remaining of the year. So now starting in January, if you want to do this again, we still now need to rebuild the base because you lost it. So you're going to start over with aerobic capacity building towards power, but with less frequency. And then
Kelsey can't do like
less. I want more.
She's like, let's go.
But then macro 2, then I think we could introduce some anaerobic work.
So how many times per week do you want me to do?
3, because the thing is you're lifting 4 times a week, heavy, and you're running. Okay. You're running outside, so it's a lot more pounding. So I think 3 would be a good starting point, and we'll reassess.
Bam.
Oh, now you have pressure because it's been
well,
said.
That's why I need it. Once it's said, it's
said
good.
Out there.
Okay, next question around the same topic. Does all your conditioning come from strongman sessions?
No. So a lot of it does, but obviously if someone needs to be good at a very specific type of aerobic activity or conditioning activity, they need to do their conditioning in that format. All the adaptations to conditioning are super specific to the tissues that are being used. So if you want to be good at running, you better fucking run. Like pushing a prowler, is it similar? Yes, but it's not going to be the exact same motor units. It's not going to be the same sequencing. You're not developing as many strides, it's high stride frequency. Like all that's different. So you have to be very specific with the conditioning type you want if you want to be good at that style of conditioning. Now, if you just want to be good general conditioning, strongman is fantastic because you're developing a ton of different movement patterns. You can move at different velocities within the session. You can move in different planes of movement. You can use different implements. You can be in different, bring yourself through different body positions that you're very rarely going to be in or other weightlifting or just general day-to-day life. So the likes of the animal crawls and stuff like that, they're really challenge you in different ways. But so it's so dependent on the goal of the conditioning. And
I think as a personal trainer, like the conditioning is just, it's fun to do for the clients and have your clients do it. And like what you were saying, people always forget that when you go out and you run, how different it is for your body. So a lot of people go out, run, and obviously it's a lot more, you're pounding your own body weight constantly when you're running. So for the majority of clients people work with, a lot of the time implementing the conditioning is safer.
But one issue with strongman, and there's a couple, but one issue is with hyper competitive people and if they're doing it by themselves, they struggle to keep the same level of motivation as opposed to having something with a set target.
Yeah.
So rower, bikes, running, stuff like that there that they can set. All right, so every minute I'm going to do 300 meter intervals. I'm doing it within a minute, taking a minute off on a rower, something like that there. Doing 5 minutes in a row, taking 3 minutes rest, doing 2 sets. They have objective targets that they can hit, and you can implement slight variations of either more distance covered or slightly shorter rest periods while maintaining the same distance, and it keeps the motivation way higher. But on the same hand, they are now locking into, they're using the same piece of equipment for their conditioning for a longer period of time. So you're going to increase the chances of overuse injuries, increase the chance of creating excess fatigue in the same muscle groups going into your sessions during the week. So there's a pro and con.
Yeah, it kind of sorry, go.
But based on what he's saying, maybe you could talk about the limitations that you saw running the conditioning classes in California based on the target, because that's really important.
Yeah. So depending on the person and their motivation level to actually put in a lot of work. I mean, some people in 30 seconds could do, like, let's say if we were doing trap bar deadlift, they did like 10, and then other people were able to do 30. So there's still a way that you can track, but it's just harder for people to. I find like when I do it myself, I always count. I'm always counting something.
Yeah, but from week to week.
From week to week, yeah, and then you have to be consistent with that, and then just know your body that you're actually pushing yourself to do it a bit more and a little bit more energetic every time.
Because one of the problems too is because it was not like this like really fixed target, you had people that they would do the class, but their level of exertion was just going through the motion. So 1 week, like you were saying, maybe with the prowler, they covered like 60 meters in 20 seconds, but then week 2, they're not motivated. They're covering 21 meters in 60 seconds. So it's a little harder to truly track. But assuming that the client has the motivation to go all out all the time, I like modified strongman for conditioning a lot, just for the fact of all the points that Porig brought up, but for the fact that you're getting some of that weight room strength to be applied in a more functional fashion.
Yeah. The last part of this question is, if the client doesn't have strongman tools, what's your best conditioning methods? But a lot of the times I find, like, even with our conditioning guide or what we do, or even what we had to do when we were running our group training, is there were times where the clients couldn't use the strongman tool specifically because it was too heavy or too hard. We had to load it heavier for the majority of the clients. So
it's like a complex.
But we used regular gym equipment. We used dumbbells. We used bars we had to create the same type of movement patterns, but without the strongman equipment.
Do body weight stuff. You can.
Yeah, I mean, like,
there's a bunch of. You can do a complex. Like people would do a barbell complex with like, you know, you're doing overhead press or push press, and then you move on to a squat, and then you move on to some sort of deadlift or lunge, or there's ways to do it.
But what I think is really cool that's very complementary to strength work, that is cheap as hell, that does not require a lot of equipment or a lot of space, is you get a jump rope and what's the name of the balls that bounces a little bit?
Rebound? Yeah. Is it a rebound ball?
Let's say it's a rebound ball, like a
bouncy
let's say
ball.
8 to 12 pound rebound ball. There's lots you can do. You can do ball slam, and then you grab it on the catch. You can do multi-directional ball slams. You can do
ab twists
on the wall, and then mixed in with some jump rope. So you're getting some loaded, dynamic, high velocity potential exercise that will raise your heart rate. That's what we're talking about. What, like a $40 investment with a small square footage, and you can have a pretty good workout.
I've seen people do a lot with like the landmine, like, you know, they can do more dynamic things with like the bar.
Like the guy on Instagram, the landmine guy or whatever.
I mean, it's impressive.
Yeah, he does it's cool stuff. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Push, pull, leg training split. What's your thoughts?
Not much.
I mean, we do push-pull. I mean,
No.
like our-
No, push-pull legs. So
Oh, push-pull
like
leg.
day one's push, day two's pull, day
Oh.
three's legs. Realistically, the only time I ever use that one is if someone wants to train 6 days a week. So, because the frequency will really
So
work
it'll
out
just be
well.
push, pull,
Legs,
leg,
push, pull, legs. You're really going to have to manage overall volume because most people can't actually recover from 6 days a week with full, like, 60-minute long or 50 to 60-minute long resistance training sessions. So either slightly less overall sets, but the one benefit of it is everything is, you can give a little bit more volume to each muscle group and it's still getting a twice a week frequency, which is really good on a hypertrophy perspective. On a strength perspective, I don't really think it's going to work very well.
Won't you have to take longer rest too if you're only doing push?
You would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can do a agonist antagonist double station
Yeah,
superset, but what we don't know with this question is it like Monday push, Wednesday pull, Friday legs? If that's the case, to me it's completely
Yeah,
useless.
it's the only time if you're going to do it is 6 days a week.
Okay.
Like you could do it, but you're wasting your time.
Complete waste of time.
We don't like it.
Those are our thoughts.
Because you're not subjecting the brain, the nervous system to a high enough frequency of actions to truly get a positive strength response. Like you're saturating one end of the spectrum, and then 7 days later.
Yeah. Another time it can be useful is if you're training in a very, very, very busy commercial gym, because everything's going to be single station instead of it trying to be double station. But like, I would still prefer a different split because I don't know. I don't think 6 days a week is optimal. I think it's too much. But I would prefer to, if you're trying to do a split that you're not, you're doing single station because you're in a busy place, I would be trying to do something that the muscle groups trained are complementary, that you're getting a higher overall frequency throughout the week without training everything directly twice. So I like say it's a more of a chest and bicep sort of thing. So you're working your pressing, so you're getting chest, you're getting anterior delts, you're getting triceps in your pressing movement, and then you're supplementing with bicep work. So now the chest, biceps, and shoulders, triceps are going to be trained twice a week. And then on the other upper body day, it's more of a back and tricep. So you're sort of mitigating the amount of volume and you're getting a little bit more frequency, but there's a real strong reason that we say upper one, upper two a lot.
We've thought about this.
We like it a lot more.
It's funny to me because I see it on Instagram and I ignore a lot of just what I see. I never dive in if I don't. So for years and on social media, you'll always see the people that talk about push-pull days and everything. And I've never even thought about it, I've understood it on a very simple way, but I've never gone any further because I just listen to what you guys say. And then that's that.
And I also hate the idea of trashing your back and then training legs the next day. Like to me, that's just rough. Like unless it's a very machine dominant leg day, it's going to be a rough day.
Yeah.
Okay, that's our opinion. Which one should we wrap it up with? Okay, so is overall training volume something you track from block to block?
Not sure what overall means.
And I don't know what their definition of block's going to be.
Yeah. But we do.
So do you track overall training volume?
We absolutely track training volume from meso to meso, block to block, macro to macro,
Year to year.
year to year, micro to micro. But I'm not sure what overall means. But what I
Well, you definitely track training volume is the answer.
yeah. But I don't know if. By overall, he means, do we track the volume of the A, B, and C series?
Yeah. Is it tonnage? Is it volume? Is it volume load?
Yeah. So, but we track the volume of the A series because the A series is the one element in every training session that we have that has multi-joint primary movements in which you can compare the drain on a recovery perspective with another phase. Because if I'm using the entire volume of the session, and then in one phase my C series is leg press, and I'm doing 3x20, so that's 60 reps of leg press with, like, let's say 300 pounds. Okay, so that's a ton of volume load. And then the next phase, I'm doing an intensification, so the complexity of the exercise is greater, and I'm doing a triple jumper step up my C series with no added weight, but I'm doing like 3 sets of 8. So that's 24 reps instead of 60 reps. But it's a 24 reps that's highly more complex. So then what am I comparing? Like, that volume, to me, it's irrelevant. We're comparing two different things. But if I'm comparing a bench press and overhead press and front squat and back squat one phase, and then the next phase I'm comparing deadlift and incline press and dip, so that's way more relevant because we're comparing the same thing. So yes, we track volume across the board, but we track the A series volume for the most part.
Like, the example you always give is like Olympic lifters. They can afford to track everything because everything they do is so similar. Like, it's such big compound movements. It all makes sense to track. But once you start training in a more, I don't want to say well-rounded, because they do exactly what they need to do for the sport, but in the style of training that we do, and you have your bicep curls and your calf raises,
wrist extension,
like all these smaller muscle groups with more isolated exercises, you just can't look at it in the same manner.
Okay, well, it is 5 minutes until you guys have some more appointments. So the final thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap up this episode, Steph, for the newest program on our site is the 12-week functional hypertrophy weekly undulating periodization macro cycle, which you named double alternate. I just wanted you to quickly talk about it because I know a lot of people, it was this and the Tsunami Swole program that were two of the most popular programs that were selected as the gift of gains a couple of weeks ago. So if you just want to kind of quickly talk about this program.
So this program uses weekly undulating periodization.
It's because you said quickly, and now he's doing it super slow.
I'm trying to.
It's been a while since he wrote this program,
and I'm trying to find the best way to explain it so it's not confusing. But it's weekly undulating periodization using a quasi 14-day microcycle where the things double up over the course of the 2 blocks within the macro cycle. So it's a lot of variation. So it's really well suited for the high-level intermediate to advanced lifters that might do better with more variation to help with the recovery process while still trying to target strength, absolute strength, functional hypertrophy to a greater extent. But it's just a very interesting way to apply the training modalities to favor recovery while still challenging the central nervous system of a pretty advanced lifter.
Very cool. Okay, that wraps it up for today. So for those of you interested in the program, trainkilo.com, and under training programs, it'll be under specialty programs. That's where you'll also find the Tsunami Swole program. Keep sending in your questions. We know we don't answer all of them. They have to make the cut because the crew that sits in front of me can
Details.
Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe, like, give us a share. See you next week, fam.